And joining us this morning is Congressman Jeb Hensarling, who introduced a bill yesterday calling for what is essentially a TARP deadline. He joins us this morning from the Hill. Congressman, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
You essentially want to, I guess, slowly kill this. Is that right?
Well, I think it's time to terminate TARP. I think TARP has morphed into something that it was not meant to be. Originally, it was passed to be an instrument of financial stability, of taxpayer protection. Now, all of a sudden, it's being used to essentially purchase the largest automakers in the U.S. I fear it is becoming an instrument of social and political and economic change for the administration. The American people are tired of bailout mania. And also, if I could, you had talked about the stress test earlier. I mean, under the administration's own worst-case scenario, which, of course, is something we can debate, but they stress test the 19 largest financial institutions. They said, here is the capital hole. As we know, most of the banks are doing quite nicely in the private markets, filling that hole. But even if they couldn't, there's $100 billion left in the TARP fund that could be called upon to fill that hole, to take care of the systemic risk in these financial institutions. It's simply not needed anymore. It needs to be terminated.
Right. You would, basically, the money that gets paid back, right, would not recycle in the TARP. That's basically how it would work. And you set a deadline for the end of this year that would shut it down. What happens if there are problems after that? You rely on that $100 billion?
Well, several things. Number one, there's nothing that can be done with TARP that the Federal Reserve can't do under its 13(3) exigent powers. And frankly, if you're talking about merely the sums of money of taxpayer exposure, what the Fed is doing dwarfs TARP. So that's point number one. Point number two, according to the administration's own estimates, there's more than enough money to fill the capital hole in our systemically risky financial institutions, again, as defined by the administration. Number three, when we're talking about this level of taxpayer exposure, ultimately this is a program that Congress ought to come in and reauthorize. And again, when you look at the Chrysler deal, when you look at the GM deal, this is way beyond trying to establish financial stability in our marketplace. And frankly, I think it's doing more harm than good at this moment.
But Congressman, can you be more explicit and tell me why Congress has seen fit to go into these businesses, take them over, run them? I mean, what is the agenda here?
You're asking me. I've been against it from day one.
But why are they doing it?
As tragic as Chapter 11 may be, and frankly, you know, it gives a number of firms an opportunity to reorganize and survive. The only thing worse than Chapter 11 for GM and Chrysler is Chapter 11 for GM and Chrysler and 80 billion taxpayer dollars later. I mean, this is what I'm fearful of. I don't think the American people ultimately want their government to own their car companies, to own their banks, to own their mortgages. I mean, what's next? Are they going to own the local coffee shop as well? It's the slippery slope to socialism. It does not work in our economy. This is not the recipe for success.
Congressman, when they pay back the TARP, there's still this overhang of the debt guarantees that a lot of companies have gotten as well. Is there a way to clear the books of that, or is Congress going to have that in their back pocket for years to come, where they can go in and meddle, and we'll hear these guys, you know, talking about banks that had, or companies that had, you know, debt guarantees, and saying, look, you're still beholden to us, and we want you to, you know, to do this, or compensation's too much, or don't have a golf tournament, or don't advertise. I mean, maybe you need to introduce some legislation, you know, so that they can get out from under that, because paying back the TARP doesn't relieve them of the debt guarantee.
Well, listen, I think it's a good question. I would say one step at a time. But ultimately, if there are financial institutions that have been judged safe and sound by their financial regulator, if they want to pay the funds back, I can assure you the taxpayers would like to have their money back. But you bring up a good point. I mean, why is it that the major bondholders in the Chrysler reorganization all agreed to the government reorganization plan? Well, if you look, they're all TARP recipients. They took the government money. They're beholden to the government position, which ultimately is one that I believe elevated the rights of the United Auto Workers above that of other bondholders. And you just can't vilify investors and expect to work our way out of this economic recession.
It sounds like the Chrysler bankruptcy was the tipping point for you, was it not? You keep referring to that as the motivation for this legislation?
I think, again, at that point, the short answer is yes. I was very, very concerned that once we used TARP funds for something else besides financial institutions, that we were getting on the road to industrial policy, that we were picking winners and losers. And once you bail out the automakers, where does it stop? I mean, is the travel industry next? Are the airlines next? Is it home construction? Again, is it Starbucks?
Right.
Do we bail them out?
Do you believe that the Supreme Court, that this stay is anything more than just buying time to study the issue?
I don't know the answer to that. I am hopeful. I believe there are profound constitutional questions of due process, of equal protection under the law. I think our bankruptcy laws have been perverted. They have been contorted. I hope that the entire Supreme Court will look at this. So number one, there are fundamental constitutional issues here, but there are also very fundamental economic issues about the misuse of TARP funds to advance a social, an economic, and a political agenda by the administration that TARP was never meant to do.
Are you worried about what happens if these pension funds win in the end? If Chrysler liquidates, if Fiat walks away, any of those scenarios bother you at all?
Oh, well, of course they bother me, but I'm also bothered by the thousands of jobs that are lost in small business every day. But Larry's Dry Cleaners at the corner of Elm and Main is not a national icon. Nobody's heard of them. Larry can't afford a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And so everybody's hurting in this economy. Why does the federal government aid only go to the largest corporations? I don't buy into the too big to fail, yet you're not so small you don't have to pay for it. Ultimately, this debt has to be paid for. Already, the Chinese are saying, you know what, we're starting to invest in commodities. And oh, by the way, maybe the world ought to look to our currency as opposed to the dollar as the stable currency of trade in the world. And so, you know, we should be very worried that ultimately we're going to have to pay this bill. Chairman Bernanke said he's not going to monetize the debt. The Democrats won't control spending.
Right.
If the Chinese don't buy our debt, guess what's left?
Sure.
A 60% tax increase over the next decade that will crush working families and crush our economy.
In a word, Congressman, do you have the votes for this legislation, or do you know yet?
Oh, well, I have high hopes and low expectations. But listen, there's a number of Democrats on the other side of the aisle that I will approach about this legislation. I don't know that they will join on to it. But there were a number who have similar concerns to myself. So again, I'll enter with high hopes and low expectations.
Well, you are the lone sitting member of Congress on that oversight panel, so it got our attention, and we'll be watching closely. Congressman, thanks.
Thank you.
Congressman Jeb Hensarling.
All right, up next.